Owning a funeral home is not an easy feat.
It is much more difficult now than it was when we started to open a funeral home, a proper funeral home.
With over 100 years of scientific development, body preservation today is not what it used to be.
You died, you were kept at home, they put zinc on you, and they put a block of ice or something like that to preserve you for whatever short period of time.
Delving into the inner workings of the funeral process, we will gain the knowledge needed to prevent us from being swindled or hiring the services of a funeral home out of ignorance.
Because when you reach to the church and see the presentation of your relative or your loved one, you will be shocked.
The human life cycle consists of several stages. A person is born, they go to school and work, they mature, and then, eventually, they die. Around our world, people are dying at a rate of over 154,000 persons per day, through natural causes, murders, accidents, you name it. But no matter the cause of death, families rely on the services of a funeral home to help lay the bodies of their loved ones to rest. But how much is known of the things which take place behind their doors? What really happens to a corpse after it leaves the hospital bed or homes before seeing it again?
It is much more difficult now than it was when we started to open a funeral home, a proper funeral home. You have a lot of
Keith Della Penna, Managing Director of Della Penna's Funeral Home, has been in the funeral business for over 30 years. The funeral home has been a family business for decades. It began with his father in 1969. Operating a funeral home, however, is not as cut and dry as one may think. In fact, there are far more things to consider before getting into this line of business.
You have a lot of funeral homes now that aren't what we call proper funeral homes. They supply people with caskets and they do funerals, but they don't do any part of the storage or the preparation of the body. They give they sublet that to somebody, whether in Kingston or in another funeral home, and they in turn now just take the body from there, place it in a casket, and do a funeral. But to get into a full-fledged funeral home is not as easy. There are a lot of requirements now from town planning and NEPA and what have you, because these things affect groundwater, and you have to know the location that you're going to put this thing and what have you. So it wouldn't be as easy as in the past.
The death of a relative or close friend is traumatic for those left behind, even without the added burden of wrapping up the affairs of the deceased and handling funeral arrangements. Knowing what to do immediately after a person dies and who to involve is information that is shrouded in mystery to some and further beclouded by grief. Nevertheless, the first step in planning a funeral begins with the right phone call.
When a person dies, we usually get a call. We advise the family now to in turn call the police if they haven't done so already. It used to be in the years gone by that the police were never involved unless there was some foul play or suspect or is a criminal scene. But nowadays the police have to be involved in every body before we can remove the body to the funeral home. If it's referred to as a police case, it goes to another funeral home who is contracted by the government to keep bodies that are classed as police cases. Once that body has been post-mortem or a death certificate has been issued, then that body can be removed from that facility to your funeral home of your choice. If the police come on the scene and decide that it's not necessary to get that section involved, then it can be turned over to the funeral home of your choice. We would then be called again by the relatives to say that the police have come on the scene and they have said it's okay for us to remove the body.
There are two main categories under which deaths are classified. They are sudden or violent deaths and death from natural causes. In any case, it is important to have a death registered within 5 days of occurrence and have a death certificate produced at the Registrar General's Department. This legal document is useful in setting the deceased person's affairs in order, such as insurance or property matters. Working closely with a funeral home is a surefire way of getting the proper advice for putting funeral arrangements together. After dealing with the legal matters that surround registering a death, it is over to the morgue for the next step in the process.
When a body comes to the morgue, the first thing we do is we examine the body to make sure that it doesn't have anything that needs to be dealt with at the immediate time. If it's in good condition, the body is refrigerated, and once we receive the death certificate from the family members, we then go ahead and prepare the body now for burial, which is embalming.
The embalming practice predates to the days of ancient Egypt. This custom was adopted by other cultures over time and has been a part of the burial process ever since. The process by the Egyptians was known as mummification and used a totally different method than that of today's embalming process.
The embalming process is one with which a chemical is used to replace the body fluids, the blood that's in the system, to preserve the body so that it can be more lifelike and a better presentation at the time of funeral.
Today's embalming is not quite the same as mummification, as it seeks to delay the advancements of decomposition in a human body, just long enough for it to make its way into the grave. This outlook differs from that of the Egyptians, who embalmed for religious reasons, with long-term preservation in mind. They believed it necessary for them to ready a person's body for the afterlife. Embalming made its way to the Western world during the time of the American Civil War. Soldiers who died in battle had to be preserved in order to be sent home to their families for a proper burial. It was in 1861 that a man by the name of Dr. Thomas Holmes led out in a series of these procedures and is credited as being the father of modern embalming. The practice of embalming has evolved since the time of Dr. Holmes. In the Egyptian culture, a series of spices was used to help preserve the dead in the mummification process. Conversely, in Western culture, embalming employed the use of various combinations of chemicals to include arsenic, creosote, mercury, turpentine, and alcohol. Though the results were effective, these solutions were hazardous and posed a significant health risk to the embalmers, curators, and collection managers who would handle some of the embalming artifacts. This further resulted in the banning of these solutions for use in the embalming process close to the early 20th century. Since then, embalmers have embraced the use of another chemical as a suitable alternative.
We use a chemical which the main chemical is formaldehyde, which people call formalin. It is made from wood alcohol, and it's an excellent preservative. It's used in a lot of other things that you would be surprised to know the things that it's used in, but in very small and minute quantities.
Formaldehyde is a naturally occurring organic compound and has a chemical structure composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that can be found all around us. Since its discovery in 1859, credited to Alexander Mikhailovich Butlerov, a Russian chemist, and August Wilhelm van Hofmann, a professor of chemistry at the University of Berlin, formaldehyde has become an essential ingredient in the development of a variety of everyday items.
Nail polish, for instance, they use formaldehyde in nail polish. That's what gives you the hardening of the nails. I think, as a matter of fact, I think it's even used in toothpaste.
Though present in a variety of products, you may not find formaldehyde in its purest form being listed among the ingredients printed on their labels. Most manufactured formaldehyde is combined with other substances to produce formaldehyde-based resins and chemicals. These byproducts boast a myriad of useful properties that are functionally beneficial to a host of construction, automotive, aircraft, healthcare, and clothing applications, which essentially makes formaldehyde an extremely versatile and important chemical building block. Embalming a deceased body is a skill that requires much patience and care. After inspecting the body, taking note of its size and other features, the embalmer determines how much fluid is required for this process. The embalming machine is made up of a reservoir, an internal pump, and hose for transferring fluid to the body. The embalming solution is mixed in the reservoir using a measure of formaldehyde, red dye, and water. Adding red dye to the mixture aids in restoring a person's natural coloration, as well as to indicate the distribution of the embalming fluid through the body. Having an excellent knowledge of the human venous system is crucial at this point. Choosing an incision site, the embalmer then makes his cut using a scalpel and separates the opening of the incision using an incision spreader. This keeps the incision open, thus making space for the arterial tube to be inserted into the artery. With everything set up, it is now time to distribute the embalming fluid through the body. A pair of dials allows for precise adjustments to be made to the rate of flow and pressure of the fluid coming from the machine. The embalmer sets the dials to achieve desirable pressure or PSI reading for the solution passing through the tube, being careful not to set it too high. With the embalming process underway, the limbs are exercised to help the fluid to flow through the body while pushing the blood out at the same time. Depending on the circumstances, this procedure can also help in breaking rigor mortis in the joints. Once embalming satisfaction has been achieved, the machine is switched off. The incision is then sutured closed using a curved suturing needle and a length of medical-grade string known as ligature. Finally, the body is washed clean, dried, then dressed, or placed in cold storage until it is time for dressing. Having completed the process, the embalmer exercises proper safety procedure by washing both the work area and himself with a disinfectant. Then it's on to the next embalming procedure.
Embalming allows for indefinite storage because if a person is embalmed properly, that body is now preserved. It's mummified, as a matter of fact. The tissues don't break down. It would take a very long period before they start breaking down. Compared to in those days, you took the body out of the fridge, you placed it in the casket. If you didn't bury that person within the next 24 hours, you'd start to know that that person was decaying.
As effective as it may be, embalming was rarely performed a few years ago. In the early days, people used a more natural rather than chemical process to preserve bodies before placing them in a casket. You may find this method still being practiced in some parts of the world, even today.
When we started in 1969, there wasn't really much embalming being done. The body was placed on the fridge. Before that, as a matter of fact, I go back even further. Before that, people kept the bodies at home. You died, you were kept at home. They put zinc on you and they put a block of ice or something like that to preserve you for whatever short period of time. People would come to the yard. The casket would be built right on the compound, right where your person died. And in a couple of days, you had to be buried because if you didn't bury that person, you couldn't stay on the premises. You learn to cope with it and get that body in the ground as quickly as possible.
Using this naturalistic method of body preservation was sufficient for cases when death occurred at home. Things differed slightly at the funeral parlor, where bodies had to be stored in large numbers.
Bodies were kept on fridge. The day of the funeral, they were taken out and defrosted, just like you defrost your chicken, and cleaned up, clothes placed on them, and they placed in a casket. If they came across problems of decay or things like that, the only way to deal with it was cold storage. If they couldn't deal with it that way, the casket was sealed and the person was buried without any viewing or anything. Nowadays, the embalming has taken over, and a person can be kept much longer, for longer periods, a better presentation, and It's an easier process. It's a much easier process than it used to be.
The terms casket and coffin are often used interchangeably. Though similar their general purpose may be, the differences in their descriptions makes them less of a synonym. Coffins are 8-sided burial boxes that are wide at the top for the shoulders and narrower at the bottom for the feet. On the other hand, caskets are 4-sided rectangular boxes having a split lid for viewing purposes and are usually made out of metal, plastics, or wood. There are companies which specialize in the making of these burial boxes, although you will find that some funeral parlors aren't limited in their services.
We do make the caskets at our funeral home. We use local materials, depending on what the customer wants. If they want something out of cedar, we would build it out of cedar. If they want something out of maho, we'd build it out of maho. If there's no request, then we use whatever local wood is available.
No matter the material, each casket's construction is generally the same. Building a standard casket usually takes around 3 days, except in those rare occasions when the design deviates from standard specifications.
Sometimes we have to build oversized caskets for people who have a little on the heavy side like myself. You would have to build a special type of casket for them because the regular standard size casket couldn't hold them.
When it comes to color, however, the possibilities are endless.
Cremation is burning. We don't do cremation. We give it out to another funeral home in Kingston. And what they do is they place the body in an oven and the body is burnt. All the tissue is burnt off. The only thing that would remain is calcium, the bones. And this now is placed into a crusher and crushed, and this is what the relatives receive as ashes. In truth and in fact, it's not really ashes, it's just calcium from the bones.
There are religious groups today who are strongly opposed to having the dead cremated. Some Christians debate that cremation goes against the Bible and question whether it is really acceptable or properly respectful to cremate the dead, whether to God or the deceased.
I see more people requesting cremation, and talking to people in general, you will hear people say, "Boy, I don't want to be buried, I would like to be cremated." I think it's a generational thing. The older generation is going to give way to the new generation, the younger generation, which is more enlightened, more educated. So, and then there's going to be a land restraint. There's going to be a problem with places to bury people. I mean, the population is growing, maybe in the future. I don't know, I probably won't be around when that happens. But in the future, it will probably be that you'll have to be cremated because there's just no place to bury you.
On the day of the funeral, it is the duty of the funeral home to transport the body to the church at least an hour before the time of service. This is called the in-state. The body is placed in state for the family and members of the public to view.
Once the funeral service is over, we transport the body from the church to the burial ground or the cemetery, and the body is placed on a lowering device, which is a machine that lowers the body into the grave. Some people forego that and have what's called a sepulchre, which is something that you push the body underneath. It's not a lowering thing. Once the body has been lowered, we remove our machine, and the workmen come along now and seal the grave.
You may find that in some cases, the layout of a cemetery bears a certain level of impact on the disposition of graves. However, there is a custom that governs the direction in which all bodies ought to be oriented.
All bodies, as far as I know, are placed in the ground. Feet are facing east, and the head is facing west. I've never buried anybody in any other direction, as far as I know.
Historically, Christian tradition dictates having the bodies oriented in this fashion, permitting the dead to rise facing the east without having to turn around, aligning them in full view of the second coming of Christ on Judgment Day. Matthew 24 verse 27 in the King James Version gives credence to this principle. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Occasionally, limitations of space may override the compliance to this general principle. However, there are still those among us who make an effort to keep true to the tradition.
I'm certain that people have been buried in the wrong direction, because if you don't keep a track of what end of the casket you're dealing with, that can happen. But usually we put the way we put it in and the way we take it out, make sure that it is placed in the proper direction.
Death has been a reality humans have had to deal with since the inception of sin in the world. From the first death ever recorded in biblical history to the last person who will die. It is a part of what makes our circle of life, and no matter how much we dread the day when we may lose a family member or a close friend, just remember that there are people in our society who are ready and able to help you in your time of grief. Just be sure you make the right choice.
In general, be aware of the length of time that these people have been in business. Don't just go off the price. People will tell you that they will offer you things that other funeral homes won't offer you, but not necessarily because they are any better. It's just that they're trying to get your business. You may be sorry in the long run, because when you reach to the church and see the presentation of your relative or your loved one, you will be shocked, and it's a bit late at that time to do anything about it.